Hey everyone, and welcome back to our Shadowlands Alpha class preview series. Today, we're going to be taking on the Rogue, and actually with this video now being done, we have covered every single DPS spec in the game on Alpha, so you can check out the playlist if you are interested in seeing what's up with the other specs. As for the Rogues, I mean, they certainly have seen significant changes, and I think they're in a decidedly mixed state right now. There certainly is potential here, but a lot of care is going to need to be taken in order to actually get these specs from their current state on Alpha into live. So there's a lot to talk about, and with that said, let's just get stuck in, starting with the core changes that are happening across the board to every single spec. Okay, so let's get into the core changes. As always from us, this is mostly from a PvE point of view, because we're not really qualified to do in-depth PvP coverage, and that would be pretty darn disingenuous. First off, everybody now uses poisons for the rogues. Outlaw and Sub can use instant and wound as their lethal poisons, or crippling for their non-lethal. Apparently numbing is also intended, but it just hasn't been implemented in the same way yet. Now, similar to that, they all get Shiv Baseline, which is a strong, on-demand application of their chosen non-lethal poison, so that gives them some quite nice utility. Now, for a less positive change though, Crimson Vial now heals 20% over 4 seconds instead of 30 over 6, so a bit less, and that is going to sting. Now, the thing is that according to Blizzard's big class post, the idea is that Pickpocket should drop ingredients that empower the vial, so it does make sense that the baseline vial is a bit weaker, but right now that's just not implemented, so currently, it feels like a nerf, but we do have to wait and see how that mechanic pans out. Then continuing with the additions, Slice and Dice is actually back, and it's back across the board. Yep, like with the poison change, Blizzard are basically just putting more of the classic rogue feel into each spec. Now, I'll be real, I do feel that simple maintenance buffs are actually pretty boring, right, from gameplay, but in fairness, the faster attack speed from this one can have some decent, pace sort of ramifications. So yeah, I mean, it's quite tricky right now. This may just be a case of unpruning for its own sake, but I'd like to know what you think about it. So as it stands, right, rogues all share a similar baseline and great utility. The specs then change up their strengths and their weaknesses significantly, which sort of should be good. However, we then all know how catastrophic that was in BFA, so we really do have to hope that things are just better balanced in the future. And for a bit of context, and I'll explain this more thoroughly later, back in BFA, Shuriken Combo's extreme power basically led to part of the sub-rogue being gutted, and that really meant that they were never the same, as the Nyalotha stats show. Now, as for the other specs, well, Assassination's only strong source of AoE was Poison Bomb, and that was really unreliable, right, because it procced randomly, and that meant that the only spec capable of AoE really, well, was Outlaw, and that then meant that what was once called the Rogue class was basically now called the Outlaw class for the expansion. Rogues were extremely dominant in Mythic Plus as Outlaw because of their toolkit and their AoE, which exacerbated this problem, and it almost reminds us of back when Blizzard nerfed Demonology into the ground in Warlords of Draenor, only for Ian to sort of semi-seriously say, "We'd rather you didn't play Demonology." Now, that kind of happened with Sub in BFA, and if this whole sort of, we don't want you to feel like you need to play a spec, if that's still their attitude, then they certainly did fail that in Battle for Azeroth. So, with those problems sort of coloring the rogue perspective as we go into this expansion, have Blizzard actually addressed these issues for the specs? Well, as you're going to find out, it is a interesting but somewhat mixed bag. First off, we've got the assassination changes. So, right, they get a stronger version of Shiv that basically takes the functionality of the Toxic Blade talent. It's an increase to nature damage on the target. So, yeah, you just get a mini version of this talent. Baseline is a thing you're doing all the time, but the Toxic Blade talent still does exist, with it actually decreasing the cooldown of Shiv. So that's what's going on there. Now, for the poisons, well, now that they're shared, what's different about Assassination is that their versions are stronger and apply faster. They're also guaranteed to apply from stealth, which reduces some potential opener frustration. Then for Ambush, well, that is back as an option to open with over Garrote. Then tied to Ambush, the Blindside talent is now a little bit different. It gives Mutilate a 20% chance to proc a free in-combat ambush, increasing to 40% 50% in execution range. And I think that's actually quite cool in terms of what it does for just playing around with the pace of the spec, giving you that slightly different pace when you hit execute range. I think that's really cool. And generally, right, I do think that more talents could be doing things like this, you know, modifying the use of existing abilities in a fresh way that can be quite fun, and not all talents have to add a new button or just be some sort of boring flat passive that you don't really notice. Beyond that though, not much has changed, so where does this all leave us? Personally, I think that their version of Shiv being baseline gives them a pretty compelling core, right? So you're trying to fit Envenoms into a Shiv window, that's strong enough core gameplay, especially with the active bleeds giving you energy regen. And then actually on that, interestingly, Exsanguinate, whatever it's called, that now coexists with the Toxic Blade effect. And while it doesn't feel, doesn't really feel like it belongs that much in a poison build, the extra energy regen on demand could sort of synergize well there. But there are some still incomplete feeling talents. I mean, Blindside is the only interesting part of the first talent row, with elaborate planning and Master Poisoner just being too passive to really matter or be interesting. Then the bottom row is kind of awkward actually, because, well, Poison Bomb does add single target and AoE damage with not that much interaction, whereas the other two talents are pure AoE and kind of never really worth it in comparison. So I think there, some very heavy rebalancing or maybe a big rethink needs to happen for this expansion. So overall, right, not a huge amount has changed here, and I don't think there are humongous spec breaking problems to solve. Maybe, the AoE stuff could be looked at a bit. Now, Slice and Dice's addition, right, that's just a maintenance thing for you to do, so that may be frustrating for some players, and there definitely are talents here that need looked at. Again, I think Rogue mains have been and are being very open about what issues they've got with this spec, and I think some of those could be fixed or mitigated with a little bit of attention. Not a big rework, just a little bit of a look as we move through alpha. In general, though, that's the situation with Assassination, and it may be the least troubled of all of the rogue specs. Alright, it's time for Outlaw, one of the more contentious and I guess interesting to talk about specs of BFA. First off, we've got a change where Between the Eyes now increases your crit chance and damage against the target for 15 seconds. Yeah, that actually replaces the old stun mechanic that it had. It's now actually up to a 45-second cooldown, but that cooldown gets reduced by Restless Blades, which is basically a passive cooldown reduction when you spend your combo points. Now this new Between the Eyes, right, it's basically a debuff sort of damage window to have in your target, which does somewhat remove a classic Outlaw strength that they can just instantly swap to a target and get going. So I think that requirement in a target swapping scenario is going to feel kind of awful. That said, Between the Eyes, it was a range stun that kind of ended up being core to your rotation anyway because of Azerite traits in BFA. So basically, right now, you've got a different version of it, you lose the stun component, and in return you get Kidney Shot back as a melee stun. So overall, I'd say I understand the design sort of change with all of this, but the debuff maintenance to some players may feel like a downgrade. Remember, single target damage will be balanced around having good uptime of that buff, so this very much is actually a core change to how this spec plays. Next then, we do have a nerf. Riposte is being replaced by Evasion. Now, there's supposed to be a talent that will turn Evasion into Riposte again, but that doesn't exist yet. Rogues are concerned with survivability across the board, so this is a downgrade for the Outlaw spec, though it is one downgrade that brings all three specs together in their suffering when it comes to survivability. Then we've got Blade Flurry, your free Giga AoE button that has actually seen some change. So now, right, it's a single 30-second cooldown that is affected by Restless Blades, the cooldown reduction mechanic, rather than being 2 charges on a 25-second cooldown. So if you actually think about that, you will have, I'd say, very high uptime on average across a fight. However, right, that does come at the cost of you being able to pull 2 charges of it for back-to-back use. So that's kind of like your trade-off with this new design. Then there are some changes to the talent tree. Retractable Hook now makes the grappling hook faster to use. It really does feel way better, but really I think it's just a quality of life thing. It's almost like a good game design change rather than a talent that makes it more powerful, and that's why I think that at least that component of it, like, it should be baseline. Then next, Night Stalker is now on that row instead of Acrobatic Strikes, which is kind of weird. I mean, it's clearly a movement row, right? But Night Stalker is also a minor improvement on DPS, meaning that, the nice to use retractable hook would lose out because of that. And it's kind of odd then that like Acrobatic Strikes is gone. You see, Acrobatic Strikes, that increased your melee range, and that's gone now, seemingly. We don't know if that's going to stay that way. Now, I could understand them removing it in order to keep Outlaw, Rogue, like Blade Flurry, AoE a bit more in check by reducing their range. But, I mean, it doesn't seem to make much sense if that is the justification, because Blizzard have implemented an AoE target cap, so I don't really know why they've done that. To temper expectations here, though, Slice and Dice has not been replaced on any tree, so there just might be stuff that's up in the air with these talents being a little bit weird and unfinished. At any rate, though, I think Blizzard, for that, should really let their testers actually know what is final and what is not final, so that we actually know what to expect. Anyway, with that, it's time to get on to the big thing, the elephant in the room, Roll the Bones, which no longer costs combo points and is instead a cooldown. Now, this is clearly intended to stop the issue of a dice roll telling you if it's time to play your video game. For context, right? Roll the Bones RNG was such that if your RNG wasn't good, you would want to re-roll Roll the Bones to get better buffs. Now, this kind of meant that you were just sort of fishing for the good RNG, right? You were basically just there waiting for good RNG before you really felt like you could get down to business on your spec. Now, for some people, maybe who didn't care as much about having consistent performance, that was kind of fun, right? Because you could just get really lucky and then do crazy damage. But for a lot of these super performance-oriented players, it did feel like they were being held back by that RNG. So basically, it seems like Blizzard didn't really like the re-rolling that was going on, maybe because they just realized that most players just let a weak aura do all the thinking, right? You know, they'd have a re-roll button, and whether that flashed on or off, that would dictate their re-roll. So their solution here is really simple. It's just to prevent players from re-rolling frequently by moving Roll the Bones onto being a cooldown that is reduced by Restless Blades. And that basically means that you're more or less just pressing it whenever it's available, unless you have got good buffs that you do not want to replace. If you roll bad buffs, too bad. You've just got to you've got to keep them. That's it, until, of course, you get your cooldown back. You can't change your luck. Now, that certainly does solve the problem of players re-rolling, but it may not actually fix why the players re-rolled. There are, so many combinations of Roll the Bones that it was better to keep on rolling it until you got really good rolls. And this resulted in, it kind of felt like a slot machine, but just some frustrating moments on live. You see, a few of the buffs have a relatively meaningful impact in gameplay and can be super fun when they're up. And that does make it a great fun ability on paper, but the RNG component was barely capped, right? Because, rolling 5 buffs, that's an extremely unlikely thing, but it does result in huge damage. And while having that high point of excitement is really cool, the gulf between the low and the high end of that RNG led to massive variance, right? And that meant that you had to re-roll often for, to sort of quash the impact of the lower end of, how good your buffs could have been when you used it. Now, in BFA, this was helped by the Loaded Dice talent, which did guarantee you getting 2 buffs if you used Roll the Bones during Adrenaline Rush. The thing is, though, right? Back in Legion, Loaded Dice was essentially baseline because it was added to your artifact as a passive trait. And honestly, right, I think it is a core usability thing that you need for that spec to actually feel fun, in my personal view, and I think that having that be locked behind a talent is, to be completely frank with you, awful design. Really bad. Just like, how did they even think that was a good idea? Tier annoying, for my personal perspective. Now, this bad RNG with Roll the Bones can still happen in Shadowlands, but you have lost the ability to re-roll regularly, and that means that, you cannot balance out the bad RNG as much. It's kind of like in the stock market. It's almost like the idea of, cutting your losses, so re-rolling, and letting your profits run, so, getting the maximum duration for your really good rolls, and that idea of cutting your losses and letting your profits run, if you were then massively throttled in your ability to buy and sell in a time basis, it would sort of ruin that. And that's kind of what you see mapped onto the rogue problem here. Now, the easiest fix is to reduce the layers of randomness and to even out the buffs a little bit better. Now, we are far from qualified to say how that should be done, but there has obviously been a lot of online discussion over what measures could be taken. I think the most simple, quick one would be to maybe remove the 2 worst buffs, to remove the chance of getting 5 buffs at all, and to make Loaded Dice a baseline. That would be less exciting, yes, but it would be more functional. At its core, Roll the Bones I think is a super cool, potentially fun ability, but it needs its pain points taken away. I think the massive RNG version of it would work great, as a build in an action RPG like Path of Exile or Diablo, but in World of Warcraft, it just does face problems. Then beyond that, there are just some talent things that need rebalanced. There's like Ghostly Strike, which doesn't really work with Killing Spree, and you're like, why is that going on? What's actually intended there? Just some stuff that maybe needs to be looked at again. Overall, though, look, this is going to feel notably worse with the current changes, I think. I think that maybe forcing people to live with their bad luck from Roll the Bones, I think that does solve a problem in a very simple way, but it also faces problems in real-world scenarios, because at the end of the day, this is an MMO in which people are playing these specs for hundreds or thousands of hours. I think the player experience should come first, and I think we just need a way to keep as much of the cool identity of Roll the Bones, but actually work out how we can make it work with the game in a realistic scenario. So overall, it seems like the core of Outlaw is rather mixed right now, and certainly more work is needed. And finally, Sub. So for subtlety, it's kind of interesting. Find Weakness, which applies an armor bypass debuff to your enemy, well, that's no longer a talent, it's actually baseline. Then in addition to applying from stealth, it also applies whenever Shuriken Storms and Backstabs critically strike. Now, you will need to be behind your target for the Backstab to apply it though, which does actually leave Subtlety as the only class with a key positional. And in general, I'd love to see, what would Blizzard do if they looked at Final Fantasy XIV's positional classes like the Dragoon and maybe try to incorporate some of those ideas into something. But anyway, as for the change itself, this version of Find Weakness should almost have 100% uptime, which just sort of means that it's a maintenance debuff that's applied passively. But there is a fun interaction with Symbols of Death, though, a change that's been made to it. So Symbols will now also make it that your next combo point generator will crit. Now that means that it will always apply Find Weakness if, you use them together, and since that includes Shuriken Storm, it's a great way to spread the Find Weakness, right? You will use your Symbols of Death into your Shuriken, you'll get all your Find Weaknesses around. But the thing is, there's actually more to Find Weakness, because in addition to it ignoring armor, it now causes targets to take shadow damage from two things. First, your Eviscerates, and second, Shadow Vault, which is your new AoE finisher. Yeah, it's a little bit weird to be jumping in the air and throwing shurikens everywhere. It's not exactly subtle, but it's kind of cool, I guess. So what this actually seems like, though, is an attempt to solve Sub's general lack of AoE, because, well, basically, right, in patch 8.1, Sub's explicit weakness was AoE damage, but they made up for that by essentially powering up their single target damage after using Shuriken Storms. But this led to them being extremely overpowered on Zul, and in response to that, Blizzard actually removed that passive effect entirely, which meant that they had nothing to make up for their bad AoE damage. But now, with Shadow Vault, well, they do have fairly regular AoE, and what's cool about that is they can spread their Find Weaknesses, and then they can use the Shadow Vault to hit all those Find Weakness targets, and yeah, it's actually a pretty cool interaction, so that's a whole patched up in Sub. But changes do not end there. So Dark Shadow was a talent that increased your damage when in Shadow Dance, but a version of that talent is now baked into Shadow Dance as a part of a broader redesign of that ability. So Shadow Dance now only has a single charge, it's got a 60-second cooldown, and it lasts for 8 seconds, up from 5 seconds. Now, that Dark Shadow talent does still exist, it just increases the Shadow Dance damage bonus from the 15% it is baseline to 30%. So, it'll certainly be interesting to see how that talent competes with the others in its row, and some of that may not exactly mesh with the class update post, so we'll have to wait and see where that actually settles. But yes, your basic thing here is Shadow Dance has been redesigned a little bit, it's a little bit more powerful baseline, but it also is a bit less frequent, and that's kind of the core of that. Then the next change is that Rupture is going to replace Nightblade. Now, Rupture is just a regular old bleed, right, that you're doing, so, the shadow damage bit of Nightblade, that is gone. And I think this is probably good, actually, because Nightblade had to be put up in order to, have your other abilities do more damage. Now, to me, part of that, part of that just felt frustrating in short fights, especially in the world, because killing something with only a few buttons from stealth, that big burst, I think that's a really strong part of the rogue fantasy and the sub fantasy, but knowing that, you know, you're doing less damage because your Nightblade isn't up, that kind of lessens how good that feels. So yeah, I think Rupture, that just feels like a more proper rogue ability, even if its functionality is a little bit different. Then quickly moving on, they didn't get Gouge back, sadly. Shadow Dance allowing Cheap Shot made just for a bit too much CC, so Gouge was renewed. So, how do we feel about this spec then? I think sub, as it currently exists, feels a little bit bland, but it does kind of work. Less frequent Shadow Dances can make it feel like a stronger part of the spec, rather than just this rolling cooldown that you're doing a lot, but I think it maybe just needs another mechanic or two to support it. Maybe, you know, I mean, right, just replacing Backstab with Shadow Strike for its duration, I don't think that feels like quite enough. I feel like there's a little bit more we could do there. There's plenty to think about with Slice and Dice, Rupture, and Find Weakness. I think they're kind of, well, especially maybe with Rupture and Find Weakness, like pretty good things, but they don't always come together in a super satisfying way, but I think that's more me saying that more could be done and less me saying that it's bad. Then if we think about the talents, it just feels incomplete right now. You know, nothing's that different. Most of it works okay at best, I would say. I think the first and last rows definitely need looked at more than others, because Secret Technique and Shuriken Tornado are pretty clear AoE choices, where Master of Shadows is the only one that really impacts single target. That's kind of like an issue we've had in other specs. Then, based on the missing talents that we've talked about, I just hope that we see more here as the alpha goes on. And also, please, Blizz, just remove Shadow Blades from the GCD. It's not a fun cooldown in the first place, so it being in the GCD just doesn't really help matters. So to conclude this, I mean, the rogue's not necessarily in an awful spot, but the class definitely does need, I think, a good bit more work, just some rebalancing, some love and care back into those three specs. All three are currently very usable indeed, but their strengths and their weaknesses aren't totally utilized. You know, outside of, say, Sub needing Shadow Dance to be spiced up and Outlaw needing Roll the Bones to be re-examined, you know, rogues do have a solid core, but there is a bit of me that does think that, well, Shadow Dance and Roll the Bones are pretty core to those two specs, so if players don't like those changes, they'll kind of bounce off those specs in Shadowlands, which maybe is not ideal. So yeah, there's that going on. Then also, I guess, the rogue talent trees, I mean, they're lacking in choice a little bit. You know, they've got some fun abilities that just don't really work that well in practice. I think, to me, the main thing here is it just feels quite clear that the alpha, you know, wave isn't nearly complete feeling, right? It needs a good bit more. And right now, it's just hard to know if Blizzard actually intend to change that much as time goes on. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, there is just this thing where we don't know if some stuff is intended. It would be really nice if, you know, an alpha build is making some changes and Blizzard actually told us what is actually work in progress, what is approaching final, what is something that's just there for placeholder and will be scrapped and changed. They've sometimes done that, right? Like they had an update to the Feral Druids and to the Balanced Druids, and you know, while maybe not ideal, they at least explained their thinking and they helped us give some feedback there, right? But with this, it's just, I would really like to know more about what Blizzard thinks. So maybe if just one of their designers was to do a blue post, I think that would help people who are testing the class a lot, and would certainly make the rogues, I mean, feel like they're being listened to a little bit more. So there you go. That is our alpha preview of the rogues. Is it good? Is it bad? I'm not quite sure yet, but I will say it certainly is interesting. And as the runtime of this video suggests, there was a fair bit to talk about indeed. So let me know, what are you thinking, especially if you are a rogue from the BFA Legion era or one from before that era. I would love to know. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.